Welcome to Crisis in Perception. When you look at a map of the United States, those shapes, they feel permanent, right? Almost natural. But here's the thing, they're not. At all. They're actually a story of human conflict, ambition, and power. Today, we're diving into the ideas from Mark Stein's How the States Got Their Shapes Too, to see how every single one of those borders is really just a battle, frozen in time.
Yeah, we see these shapes all the time. We learn them in school, right? And we just kind of assume they're as fixed and permanent as, say, a mountain range or a river. But those lines? Nope. They are completely man-made. And boy, do they have a story to tell. So let's just chew on that for a second. What if every single one of those borders is a battle, frozen right there on the map? What if we start to read this map not as geography, but as a giant mural of old fights? Every straight line, every weird jagged edge, it's like a scar left behind from a fight over power, over resources, over ideology. Because, a border is never just a line on a map. It's so much more than that. Think of it like a switch. The second you cross it, boom, the laws change. Who you vote for changes. Who controls the water or the land changes. It's a huge instrument of power, and where that line gets drawn, well, that changes everything.
So how do these incredibly powerful lines even get made in the first place? It's definitely not random. There's this whole hidden system at work, a process that turns these messy political fights into solid physical geography. So let's pull back the curtain and see how this thing actually works.
Okay, so the best way to really get our heads around this system is with a metaphor. I want you to think of a state border like wet cement being poured into a form. It starts out all fluid and messy and contested, right? But it ends up as something solid, something really, really hard to move. And it pretty much happens in 4 steps. First, you've got the conflict itself. All those arguments over land or slavery or who gets the river. That's the wet cement getting poured. Then you've got the form. Political compromises and backroom deals, they act like the wooden frame that gives the cement its shape. Step 3 is the hardening. A treaty gets signed, a law gets passed, and that line is now official. The cement sets. And finally, the foundation. All of our institutions, courts, elections, property laws, they get built right on top of that hardened line. It's now part of the bedrock of society.
All right, so if the conflict is the wet cement, what exactly is getting poured into that form? What are the raw ingredients of these fights? Let's call them the incentives, the real motivations that pushed people to draw a line here instead of, say, 10 miles over there. So what was this cement actually made of? Well, it was a mix of all sorts of things, really, from these huge historical forces down to just plain old personal ambition. A massive driver was political balance, that constant, desperate struggle between the free states and the slave states for control of the Senate. Then you had pure economics, with states fighting tooth and nail for access to a port on the Great Lakes or the flattest route for a new railroad. A much, much darker ingredient was, of course, indigenous displacement. Borders were literally drawn right on the back of forced treaties and land cessions. And sometimes, it was as simple as one powerful person wanting to carve their name into the map. So when all those incentives get mixed together and that cement hardens, you get the map we see every day. It's literally a direct record of all these deals and settlements, some negotiated, many coerced. Let's look at a few real-world examples of how this process created the shapes we just take for granted now.
This is a great one. On the left, you see Thomas Jefferson's vision for the Western states. Super logical, right? A nice, clean grid. But now look at the map on the right, our map. Congress totally rejected Jefferson's idea. And why? Because his plan created a bunch of smaller states, which would have given the West way too much power in the Senate. So to protect their own influence, the powerful eastern states made sure the new territories were fewer and bigger. It's a perfect case of raw political calculation just crushing rational design. And you can't get a clearer, more powerful example than this line right here, the Missouri Compromise line. This wasn't just some suggestion. This was a dam built to hold back the floodwaters of the conflict over slavery. That one single line on the map, 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude, it declared that any new state north of it had to be free. It's a physical border literally drawn by the deepest, most bitter political fight in the nation's history. And sometimes the outcomes are just weird. Get this, New York and New Jersey actually have 2 borders between them? Yeah, 2. One is the shoreline, which makes sense. But there's a second one, totally underwater, that runs right down the middle of the Hudson River. Why? Well, it was an economic compromise, so New Jersey could build out its own commercial piers. It's a perfect little example of an economic squabble literally hardening into a permanent two-layered piece of geography.
And this right here, this is the whole crisis in perception. We look at a map and our brains see geography. We think it's natural, it's just there, but it's not. What we're actually looking at are the hardened results of old political fights, backroom economic deals, and social compromises. We're looking at institutions frozen in time and space.
Okay, so if these lines were just drawn up by people arguing, why can't we just redraw them, right? Why are they so darn persistent, even when they're based on centuries-old conflicts or, straight-up mistakes? Let's dig into why that hardened cement is so incredibly hard to crack.
The short answer is that the entire system is designed to reward stability. This quote from the Supreme Court really hits the nail on the head. It basically says that even if a border was drawn wrong in the first place, the simple fact that everyone has just gone along with it for a really long time, what the court calls long acquiescence, that alone gives it legal power. In other words, tradition pretty much becomes law. The system is just built to keep the lines exactly where they are.
And this takes us right back to our wet cement. Once it hardens, and once you build the entire foundation of government and society on top of it, you can't just knock down a wall and move it. Trying to shift a state border today would mean cracking the entire foundation of who has jurisdiction, who owns what property, and who gets to vote for whom, a foundation that's been built up over centuries. It's just too messy, too disruptive. But the story doesn't quite end there. That foundation, that hardened cement, it doesn't exist in a bubble. The whole system of making borders is itself nested inside other, even bigger historical systems that shaped America. These lines on the map, they both reflect those powerful forces and, in turn, reinforce them.
You can think of it like a set of those Russian nesting dolls. The process of drawing state lines is one doll, but it sits right inside these bigger ones, the core ideas and structures that really defined the nation's development. So what are those bigger dolls? Well, think about it. The entire project rests on settler colonialism, which was all about displacing and containing Native American populations. The lines were fundamentally shaped by racial hierarchy, like when there were failed attempts to create all Black or all Native American states. They were driven by capitalism, with borders literally drawn to help out private companies. Look at the Gadsden Purchase, which was all about securing a good route for a southern railroad. And the whole thing played out within the arena of federal governance, the system that was the referee for all these brutal fights for land and power. So if the map we have today is really just a frozen record of past battles over slavery, land, and industry, it kind of leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? What are the great conflicts of our own time? Fights over data, over climate, over ideology. And what invisible lines are they drawing across our world right now?
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a longer, audio-based analysis of this topic, see the deep dive linked in the description. If you enjoyed this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.